Good evening, and welcome back to Plane Crash for Sleep. I'm glad you're here. I want you to get comfortable, really comfortable. Take your time adjusting your pillows, arranging them just so beneath your head and neck. Pull your blanket up to whatever height feels right, feeling its weight settle over you like a gentle reminder that you're safe, you're here, you're allowed to rest. Dim the lights until they're barely glowing, or turn them off completely if darkness is what you need tonight. Take a deep breath now, slowly, filling your lungs completely, and then let it out even more slowly, feeling the tension drain from your shoulders, from your jaw, from every muscle that's been holding you up all day. We're about to travel together, you and I, back through time to a summer afternoon in July of 1989, to the skies above Iowa, where a routine flight became something that should have been impossible, where an uncontained engine failure severed every line of control in an aircraft, where 4 pilots worked together to attempt what had never been done before, and what many thought could never be done. Flying a massive airliner with nothing but engine thrust to steer it, bringing it to an airport, attempting a landing that every simulator test afterward would show was virtually impossible. This is the story of United Airlines Flight 232. It's a story about a microscopic defect in titanium, about a tiny inclusion of nitrogen that created a flaw no inspection could detect, about a crack that grew slowly over 18 years until it reached critical size on one particular Wednesday afternoon. It's a story about the physics of metals, about how titanium behaves when it's melted and cooled, about manufacturing processes in the early 1970s that seemed perfect but contained hidden vulnerabilities. It's a story about redundancy and how even the most carefully designed backup systems can be defeated by a single catastrophic event, about assumptions built into aircraft design, about the idea that some failures are too improbable to plan for. But most of all, it's a story about people, about Captain Al Haynes and his crew, about an off-duty pilot named Denny Fitch, who happened to be aboard as a passenger, about teamwork and communication and resourcefulness under the most extreme pressure imaginable, about making decisions in real time when no training or manual could help, about staying calm when panic would have been completely understandable. This is the story of an accident that killed 112 people, but also saved 184 people. An accident that the National Transportation Safety Board later determined should have killed everyone aboard. An accident where skilled pilots achieved what simulator testing proved was impossible: getting the aircraft to an airport at all, let alone close enough to a runway that many could survive. It's a story about crew resource management, a concept that was relatively new in 1989, but that Flight 232 would validate so completely that it would transform pilot training worldwide. It's a story about a community in Iowa that responded to disaster with extraordinary preparation and compassion, about first responders and medical teams, and ordinary citizens who saved lives through their actions. It's a story that still, more than 3 decades later, serves as both a cautionary tale about the limits of engineering and a testament to what skilled humans can accomplish when everything else fails. So settle in, let your breathing slow and deepen, and let me take you back to that Wednesday afternoon, to the moments before everything changed. The date is July 19th, 1989, a Wednesday. The time is just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Mountain Daylight Time. Though, as with all these stories, time will soon take on a different quality, will stretch and compress in ways that only exist in emergency. For now, though, Picture the scene. If you close your eyes, and please do, let them close gently, you can almost see it. The sky over the American Midwest is a deep, clear blue. The kind of perfect summer day when the air is warm but not oppressive, when visibility extends for miles, when flying is pure pleasure. Denver's Stapleton International Airport, where our story begins, sits at an elevation of 5,333 feet above sea level, high enough that pilots must account for the thinner air. But on this particular afternoon, the weather is flawless. Temperature in the mid-80s Fahrenheit, light winds, unlimited visibility. The kind of day when everything works as it should, when no one has any reason to worry. At one of Stapleton's gates, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 sits preparing for departure. Registration number N1819U, United Airlines. The aircraft is a DC-10-10, the original production version of McDonnell Douglas's tri-jet widebody, powered by 3 General Electric CF66D engines, 2 mounted on pylons beneath the wings, 1 mounted in the tail, at the base of the vertical stabilizer. This particular aircraft has been flying for United Airlines since it was delivered new from the McDonnell Douglas factory in Long Beach, California, in October 1971, nearly 18 years ago. In those 18 years, N1819U has accumulated 43,401 total flight hours and 16,997 cycles, takeoff and landing pairs. This is substantial, but not extraordinary for a commercial airliner of this age. The DC-10 is designed to fly for decades, and this aircraft is still relatively young by industry standards, well maintained, with all required inspections current, with no history of major problems. Just another reliable aircraft in United's fleet. The DC-10 itself represents a particular moment in aviation history, a time when the industry was transitioning from the narrow-body jets that had dominated the 1960s to the wide-body jets that would dominate international travel for the next half-century. McDonnell Douglas launched the DC-10 program in 1968, competing directly with Lockheed's L-1011 TriStar for orders. From airlines seeking aircraft that could carry large numbers of passengers on transcontinental and international routes without requiring the 4 engines of the Boeing 747. Both the DC-10 and L-1011 used 3 engines, a configuration that provided good fuel efficiency while maintaining the ability to continue flying if one engine failed. American Airlines launched the DC-10 program with a large order in 1968, and United Airlines soon followed with its own order. The first DC-10 flew in August 1970, and the type entered service in August 1971. By July 1989, DC-10s are flying with dozens of airlines worldwide, having proven themselves capable and generally reliable despite some well-publicized accidents, including the devastating American Airlines Flight 191 crash at Chicago O'Hare in 1979. The aircraft systems are complex and sophisticated, particularly its flight control system. Unlike smaller aircraft where pilots move control surfaces through cables and rods connected directly to their control yokes and pedals, the DC-10 uses hydraulic power to move its large flight control surfaces, the ailerons that control roll, the elevators that control pitch, the rudder that controls yaw, plus the flaps and slats that extend for takeoff and landing, and the spoilers that disrupt lift and help with braking. These surfaces are so large, and the aerodynamic forces on them so powerful, that no pilot could physically move them without assistance. The hydraulic system provides that assistance, using pressurized fluid, essentially specialized oil, to power actuators that move the control surfaces. When a pilot moves the control yoke, they're not directly moving the control surfaces. They're moving cables that move valves that direct hydraulic fluid to the appropriate actuators, which then move the surfaces. The DC-10's hydraulic system is designed with redundancy as a fundamental principle. There are three completely independent hydraulic systems, each with its own reservoir of fluid, its own pumps, its own lines, its own actuators. Each system is powered by a pump driven by one of the three engines. System 1 by the left engine, System 2 by the tail engine, System 3 by the right engine. The systems are separated physically, with lines routed through different parts of the aircraft, so that damage to one system won't affect the others. Each flight control surface has actuators connected to at least two different hydraulic systems, and some surfaces have actuators from all three systems. The logic is straightforward. If one system fails, the other two can compensate. If two systems fail, already an extremely unlikely event, the third can still provide enough control to fly and land the aircraft safely. The scenario where all three systems fail simultaneously was considered so improbable during the design and certification process that it wasn't even tested. The odds of a single event causing all three systems to fail were calculated to be on the order of 1 billion to 1. Such a failure was essentially impossible, or so everyone believed. On this Wednesday afternoon in July 1989, United Airlines Flight 232 is scheduled to fly from Denver to Philadelphia, with a stop in Chicago. The flight will cover approximately 900 miles from Denver to Chicago, then another 700 miles from Chicago to Philadelphia, a total journey of about 4 hours of flying time. The aircraft is loaded with fuel accordingly, enough for the flight with appropriate reserves for weather or diversions. The passenger load is 285 people, plus a crew of 11, 3 pilots in the cockpit, 8 flight attendants in the cabin, for a total of 296 souls aboard. This is substantial, but still well below the DC-10's maximum capacity. The passengers represent the usual cross-section of travelers: business people heading to meetings, families on vacation, people visiting relatives, the normal mix of humanity that fills commercial flights every day. In the cockpit, preparing the aircraft for departure, are 3 highly experienced pilots. The captain, Alfred Clare Haynes, everyone calls him Al, is 57 years old and has been flying for United Airlines for 33 years, since 1956. Haynes began his flying career in the United States Marines, where he learned to fly in the tradition of military aviation, precise, disciplined, by the book. After leaving the Marines, he joined United and has spent more than 3 decades progressing through the ranks, flying various aircraft types, accumulating experience, earning the respect of his colleagues. He has logged 29,967 total flight hours, an enormous amount of experience, and of those hours, 7,190 have been in the DC-10. He knows this aircraft intimately, has flown it in every season and condition, understands its characteristics and quirks. Haynes is the kind of pilot other pilots look up to: calm, professional, unflappable, someone who takes safety seriously, but who also understands that flying should be done with competence, not fear. In the right seat is First Officer William R. Records, Bill to his friends, age 48. Records has approximately 20,000 total flight hours, accumulated over a career that included time with National Airlines and Pan American World Airways, before joining United in 1985. Of his hours with United, 665 have been in the DC-10, enough to be thoroughly qualified, but still building DC-10 specific experience. Records will be the pilot flying on this leg, the one actually manipulating the controls during takeoff and most of the flight, with Captain Haynes monitoring and backing him up. This division of duties is standard in commercial aviation. Both pilots are fully qualified to fly the aircraft, and they alternate roles on different legs to maintain proficiency and share the workload. Behind and between the 2 pilots sits the flight engineer, Dudley J. Dvorak, age 51. Dvorak was hired by United in 1986 and has accumulated approximately 15,000 total flight hours. Over his career, his flight engineer time includes 1,903 hours in the Boeing 727 and just 33 hours in the DC-10. He's relatively new to this aircraft type, but experienced in the role of flight engineer. The flight engineer on a DC-10 doesn't fly the aircraft, but instead manages its complex systems, monitoring fuel, hydraulics, electrical power, pneumatics, engines, constantly scanning the engineer's panel to ensure everything is operating normally, ready to respond if any system shows signs of problems. The three men represent about 65,000 combined hours of flight experience. They are professionals at the top of their field, working for one of America's most respected airlines, operating one of the world's most capable aircraft. They have every reason to be confident about this flight. The preparation proceeds normally. The pilots complete their checklists, programming the flight management computer with the route, setting radios, checking that systems are functioning. The flight attendants prepare the cabin, ensuring passengers are seated, bags stowed, seatbelts fastened, doors closed and secured. Ground crews complete fueling, loading bags and cargo, disconnecting ground power and air conditioning. At 2:09 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, right on schedule, Flight 232 pushes back from its gate, starts its engines, and begins taxiing toward the departure runway. Everything is routine, mechanical, practiced. Within minutes, the DC-10 is rolling down Stapleton's runway, accelerating, rotating, climbing into the perfect Colorado sky, turning northeast toward Chicago, settling into climb power, retracting landing gear and flaps, beginning what everyone aboard expects will be a completely normal flight. The initial climb and cruise are entirely unremarkable. The aircraft climbs to its assigned altitude of 37,000 feet, leveling off in the smooth air of the upper atmosphere. At this altitude, the outside air temperature is approximately minus 56 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in seconds. But inside the pressurized cabin, passengers are comfortable, reading, chatting, dozing, passing the time as passengers do. The flight attendants begin their service, moving through the cabin with drinks and snacks. In the cockpit, the pilots monitor their instruments, make occasional radio calls as they're handed off from one air traffic control sector to another, discuss routing and weather, maintain the professional but relaxed atmosphere of experienced crews on a routine flight. First Officer Records is flying, his hands light on the controls, even though the autopilot is doing most of the work. Captain Haynes monitors, cross-checks, backs up his first officer. Flight Engineer Dvorak scans his panel, watches fuel consumption, keeps an eye on all the complex systems that keep a DC-10 flying. 1 hour and 7 minutes after takeoff, at approximately 3:16 p.m. Central Daylight Time, the aircraft is now in the Central Time Zone, having flown east from Mountain Time. Something happens inside the number 2 engine, the tail-mounted engine. The aircraft is in a very slight right turn, probably just a few degrees of bank, adjusting its heading slightly, when deep inside the engine's fan section, a crack that has been growing for years reaches its critical length. The crack exists in the Stage 1 fan disc, a large disc of titanium alloy that spins at high speed and to which the engine's 24 fan blades are attached. This disc is about 8 feet in diameter and weighs approximately 380 pounds. It spins at up to 2,500 revolutions per minute during normal operation, experiencing enormous centrifugal forces, and every part of it must be perfect, because any failure at these rotation speeds releases catastrophic amounts of energy. But this disc is not perfect. Hidden inside its structure, invisible to every inspection it's undergone, is a defect that was created when the disc was manufactured in late 1971. The defect is what metallurgists call a hard alpha inclusion, a region where nitrogen contamination during the melting and casting of the titanium created material with different properties than the surrounding metal. This inclusion was small, microscopic, formed during the double vacuum process used to melt and refine the titanium billet from which the disc was machined. The inclusion didn't melt at the same temperature as the rest of the titanium, didn't flow the same way, didn't have the same strength or ductility. At some point during the forging or machining process, this inclusion cracked, creating a tiny flaw. During subsequent ultrasonic inspection, the flaw should have been detected. Ultrasonic testing can reveal internal defects by analyzing how sound waves propagate through metal. But the flaw was either too small or too deep or oriented in such a way that the inspection didn't catch it. The disc was approved, installed in a new CF6-6D engine, and that engine was installed in N1819U when the aircraft was built in 1971. For 18 years, that tiny crack has been growing. Every time the engine started, every time it accelerated to takeoff power, every time it experienced thermal cycling as it heated and cooled, the crack propagated a fraction of a millimeter. Metal fatigue, the phenomenon where repeated stress cycles cause cracks to grow even when stress levels are below what would cause immediate failure, worked its patient, inexorable damage. After 16,899 cycles and 42,436 hours of operation, the crack has grown large enough to critically weaken the disc. At 3:16 p.m. on July 19, 1989, with the disc spinning at high speed and loaded with centrifugal forces equivalent to millions of pounds, the remaining intact metal can no longer hold. The disc fractures catastrophically, breaking into multiple large pieces. The fracture releases unimaginable amounts of energy. The disc fragments, each weighing dozens of pounds and traveling at supersonic speed, explode outward from the fail engine. This is what's called an uncontained engine failure. The engine's casing, which is designed to contain fragments from failed compressor or turbine blades, cannot contain these massive pieces of the fan disc. The fragments punch through the engine nacelle like bullets through paper, exiting in all directions. Some pieces fly straight back, others fly sideways, still others fly forward. One large section of the disc, weighing perhaps 200 pounds, tears through the horizontal stabilizer on the aircraft's tail, punching a hole several feet across. Other fragments strike the empennage, the rear fuselage section, in dozens of places, creating a pattern of damage like shrapnel from a bomb. The debris field extends far beyond the aircraft. The main portion of the fan disc itself, still largely intact, separates from the engine and begins falling toward the Iowa farmland 37,000 feet below. It will eventually be found in a farm field near Alta, Iowa, months later, after an extensive search. But the immediate consequence of the engine failure, the catastrophic consequence, is what happens to the hydraulic lines. The DC-10's 3 independent hydraulic systems were designed to be separated, to be routed through different parts of the airframe so that no single event could damage all 3. But there's one place where all 3 systems come close together, in the tail, where the lines must run past the number 2 engine to reach the flight control surfaces in the empennage. The engine fragments, exploding outward with tremendous energy, sever the hydraulic lines for System 1 and System 3, where they run through the horizontal stabilizer. System 2's lines, some of which are carried within the engine itself to power that engine's hydraulic pump, are torn away when parts of the engine disintegrate. Within seconds, pressurized hydraulic fluid, 3,000 pounds per square inch of pressure, begins draining from all 3 systems through the severed lines. There's approximately 50 gallons of fluid in the entire hydraulic system, and it drains in less than 2 minutes, spraying from the damaged lines as a fine mist that disperses in the slipstream. In the cockpit, the sequence begins with sound and vibration. Captain Haynes and First Officer Records feel and hear a loud bang, a jolt that runs through the airframe. The autopilot, which had been flying the aircraft, immediately disconnects. It's programmed to disengage when it detects certain abnormal conditions, forcing the pilots to take manual control. First Officer Records instinctively grabs his control yoke, taking over manually. Captain Haynes immediately focuses on the engine instruments. The gauges for the number 2 engine show it failing, N1 rotation speed decreasing, exhaust gas temperature dropping, vibration indications going off scale. Haynes reaches for the number 2 engine's throttle and finds it's jammed, won't move. He tries the fuel supply controls for that engine and finds they're also jammed. The engine is clearly malfunctioning catastrophically, but the throttle and fuel controls being jammed is unusual, suggests more than just an engine problem. Then Haynes looks at the hydraulic system gauges, and his blood runs cold. All 3 hydraulic system quantity indicators are dropping, needle moving steadily toward 0. All 3 hydraulic system pressure indicators are dropping similarly. In seconds, all 6 gauges show 0. No hydraulic fluid quantity, no hydraulic pressure. Haynes's mind processes this information with the speed that comes from thousands of hours of experience, and he immediately understands that they're facing something unprecedented. The loss of all hydraulic pressure means they've lost all normal flight controls. They cannot move the ailerons to control roll. They cannot move the elevators to control pitch. They cannot move the rudder to control yaw. They cannot extend or retract flaps or slats. They cannot deploy spoilers. They cannot steer the nose wheel. They cannot actuate the wheel brakes. Every flight control surface on the aircraft is frozen in whatever position it was in at the moment of hydraulic failure. Flight engineer Dvorak begins running through emergency checklists, looking for procedures to deal with loss of hydraulic systems. There are checklists for losing 1 system, even for losing 2 systems. But there's no checklist for losing all 3 systems, because such a scenario was considered essentially impossible. The DC-10's ram air turbine, a small propeller that can deploy into the slipstream to generate emergency electrical power, can power backup hydraulic pumps, but only if there's fluid in the system to pump, and all the fluid has drained away. There is literally no procedure for what Flight 232 is experiencing, because no one ever imagined it could happen. The aircraft begins to exhibit the characteristics of an aircraft with no control inputs. It starts to oscillate in what's called a phugoid cycle, a slow vertical oscillation where the aircraft climbs slightly, slows, stalls gently, pitches nose down, accelerates, climbs again, repeating the cycle over and over. With each cycle, the aircraft loses approximately 1,500 feet of altitude. The aircraft also has a strong tendency to roll and turn to the right, probably because the right wing is producing slightly more lift than the left wing, or because there's asymmetric drag, or some combination of factors. Without working flight controls, the pilots can't correct these tendencies. First Officer Records and Captain Haynes are both pulling on their control yokes, trying every input they can think of. But the yokes move freely, with no resistance, disconnected from the flight control surfaces, doing nothing. It's like trying to steer a car with the steering wheel disconnected from the wheels. Captain Haynes, thinking quickly, realizes that they still have 2 functioning engines, the wing-mounted engines, and those engines produce thrust. If they can vary the thrust from the 2 engines they might be able to affect the aircraft's motion. Increasing thrust on the right engine and decreasing it on the left should make the aircraft turn left. Increasing thrust on both engines should make the aircraft climb. Decreasing thrust on both should make it descend. It's crude, incredibly difficult to control, and has never been practiced because no one ever imagined needing to fly this way. But it's the only tool they have. Haynes begins experimenting, adjusting the two throttles, trying to understand how the aircraft responds. At 3:20 p.m., 4 minutes after the engine failure, Haynes radios Minneapolis Air Route Traffic Control Center, which is responsible for controlling aircraft in this sector of airspace. His voice is calm, professional, almost matter-of-fact. United 232, we've had a complete hydraulic failure. The controller's response is professional too, but there's concern in his voice. A complete hydraulic failure is not something controllers expect to hear. The controller asks what assistance Flight 232 needs. Haynes explains that they're trying to maintain control using differential thrust and asks for vectors to the nearest airport. The controller provides vectors toward Sioux Gateway Airport in Sioux City, Iowa, approximately 70 miles away, and begins coordinating the emergency response. In the cabin, the passengers have felt the bang and the initial jolts, but may not yet fully understand the severity of the situation. The flight attendants, who are trained to recognize that a bang and sudden maneuvers usually mean something significant, begin their own assessments and preparations. One of the passengers in the first-class cabin, a man named Dennis E. Fitch, understands exactly how serious things are. Fitch, 46 years old, is himself a United Airlines pilot, a DC-10 training check pilot, in fact, one of the most experienced DC-10 pilots in the airline, with over 3,000 hours in this aircraft type and 23,000 total flight hours. He's traveling as a passenger, probably deadheading back to his home base or positioning for another assignment, and he's sitting in the first-class cabin, where he can see out the window and can also see the concerned faces of the flight attendants. Fitch makes his way forward to the forward galley and finds one of the flight attendants. He identifies himself as a DC-10 training instructor and offers his assistance, saying he's familiar with the aircraft and might be able to help. The flight attendant immediately conveys this information to the cockpit, where Captain Haynes makes a decision that will prove crucial to the outcome of this flight. Without hesitation, Haynes invites Fitch to the cockpit, hoping that an instructor pilot's deep knowledge of the aircraft might provide some insight into controlling it. Fitch enters the cockpit at approximately 3:29 p.m., 13 minutes after the engine failure, and quickly assesses the situation. He looks at the hydraulic gauges, showing zero pressure in all three systems. He looks at the flight controls, which the pilots are still manipulating futilely. He understands immediately that they are in a situation beyond anything he's ever trained for or even imagined. The DC-10 has no manual reversion capability, no way to directly control the flight surfaces without hydraulics. This is an aircraft designed with the assumption that hydraulic systems could never all fail simultaneously. Fitch quickly realizes what the crew is trying to do with the engines and understands that this is indeed their only option. But he also recognizes that Haynes and Records, both fighting with their control yokes and trying to work the throttles simultaneously, are overloaded. Fitch makes a suggestion. Let me take the throttles. He'll kneel between the two pilot seats and control both throttles, leaving Haynes and Records free to work the control yokes. Even though the yokes aren't doing anything, the pilot's training and instincts compel them to keep trying. Haynes agrees immediately, and Fitch takes up position, one throttle in each hand, beginning the delicate work of learning how the aircraft responds to thrust changes. What Fitch discovers over the next minutes is both encouraging and terrifying. By advancing the right engine's throttle and reducing the left engine's throttle, he can make the aircraft turn left, slowly, agonizingly slowly, but it turns. By equalizing the throttles, he can maintain relatively straight flight. By advancing both throttles, he can arrest the descent and even induce a slight climb. By reducing both throttles, he can descend. But the control is crude, imprecise, delayed. The aircraft responds slowly to throttle inputs, taking 10 or 15 seconds for changes in thrust to affect its motion. The phugoid cycle continues despite their efforts, though Fitch learns to mitigate it somewhat by anticipating the cycles and adjusting thrust accordingly. The right roll tendency persists, requiring constant left-turning inputs, more thrust on the right engine, to prevent the aircraft from rolling over. And there are no flight instruments that tell Fitch what he's doing right. He has to develop a feel for it, has to learn the aircraft's behavior through trial and error, has to build a mental model of how this crippled giant responds to throttle inputs. Over the next 20 minutes, the four pilots, Haynes, Records, Dvorak, and Fitch, work together in what will later be celebrated as a textbook example of crew resource management. Each man has a role. Fitch controls the throttles, fighting constantly to keep the aircraft from rolling right, making adjustments to steer toward Sioux City. Haynes manages communications with air traffic control, updates the company, makes decisions about their approach strategy, coordinates with the flight attendants. Records assists with throttle inputs when Fitch needs help, monitors the flight instruments, provides information to Haynes about their altitude, heading, and speed. Dvorak continues to monitor systems, manages communications with United's maintenance and dispatch, tries to find any additional information that might help them. No one panics. No one freezes. No one makes the situation about themselves. They work as a team, leveraging each person's skills and experience, communicating constantly, staying focused on the single goal of getting the aircraft on the ground with as many survivors as possible. The cockpit voice recorder, which is still operating on backup power, captures their interactions. And what's striking when you listen to the recording is how calm they sound, how professional, how they maintain the disciplined communication patterns drilled into them through years of training. There's tension in their voices, yes, but there's no screaming, no cursing, no breakdown of discipline. At one point, as they're discussing the approach to Sioux City, Fitch tells Haynes,
"I'll tell you what, we'll have a beer when this is all done."
Haynes, who doesn't drink, replies, "I don't drink, but I'll sure as hell have one tonight." The humor, the human moment in the midst of crisis, helps maintain their composure. They're too busy to be scared, as Haynes will later say in interviews. "You must maintain your composure in the aeroplane, or you will die. You learn that from your first day flying." Meanwhile, on the ground in Sioux City, emergency preparations are underway. When Sioux Gateway Airport received notification from air traffic control that a crippled DC-10 with 296 people aboard was attempting to make an emergency landing, the airport's emergency plan went into effect immediately. Sioux City is a relatively small airport, a regional facility, serving a city of about 80,000 people. But it has a comprehensive disaster plan that's been practiced regularly. Fire trucks are positioned along the runways, ambulances from throughout the region are summoned, local hospitals are alerted and begin preparing for mass casualties. By fortunate coincidence, shift changes are occurring at both the Regional Trauma Center and the Regional Burn Center at exactly this time, meaning both day and night shift staff are present, essentially doubling the available medical personnel. Also, by fortunate coincidence, the Iowa Air National Guard unit, based at Sioux Gateway Airport, is on duty this afternoon, providing 285 trained personnel who can assist with triage and evacuation. These coincidences, combined with the clear weather and daylight conditions, will contribute significantly to the number of survivors. The aircraft, meanwhile, is slowly making its way towards Sioux City, descending in its phugoid cycles, making wide right-hand turns. Turning right is easier than turning left, given the aircraft's natural roll tendency, trying to line up with one of the airport's runways. Air traffic control initially plans for the aircraft to land on runway 31, the airport's longest runway at 8,999 feet. But lining up on a specific runway requires precise control, and precise control is exactly what Flight 232 doesn't have. As the aircraft approaches the airport, executing a series of wide right turns while dumping excess fuel from its tanks, it becomes clear that they're not going to line up with runway 31. Instead, they're coming out of their final turn roughly aligned with runway 22, which is only 6,600 feet long and which is officially closed. It has a large yellow X painted on its approach end, warning pilots not to land there. But the crew has no choice. They can't maneuver precisely enough to switch to a different runway. Runway 22 is what they've got. At approximately 3:46 p.m., 30 minutes after the initial engine failure, the air traffic controller clears Flight 232 to land on any runway, recognizing that the crew will land wherever they can. The controller's voice contains a note of sympathy. United 232 Heavy, the winds currently 360 at 11, you're cleared to land on any runway. Haynes's response, captured on the cockpit voice recorder, shows his dark humor intact. Roger. You want to be particular and make it a runway, huh? The controller asks the crew to make a left turn to keep them clear of the city. Haynes responds immediately. Whatever you do, keep us away from the city. He's thinking ahead, knowing that if they don't make the runway, if the aircraft crashes short or long or to the side, he wants to be sure they're not crashing into populated areas. The aircraft is now at approximately 9,000 feet altitude, about 9 miles from the airport, descending at roughly 1,500 feet per minute, with a ground speed of about 240 knots. Fitch is fighting to keep the wings relatively level, making constant throttle adjustments, trying to maintain something approximating a stable approach path. But without flaps or slats, the aircraft's approach speed is much too high. A normal approach speed for a DC-10 would be around 140 knots. Flight 232 is approaching at 215 to 220 knots, nearly 60% faster than normal. Because without flaps and slats to increase lift at lower speeds, the aircraft will stall if it slows down too much. The descent rate is also much too high. A normal descent rate on final approach would be 300 to 500 feet per minute. Flight 232 is descending at 1,850 feet per minute, nearly 10 times faster. Because without control over pitch, they can only roughly modulate the descent rate using thrust, and the phugoid cycle continues to affect their vertical path. The pilots know these numbers are wrong, dangerously wrong, but they also know they have no better option. This aircraft is not going to land normally. The best they can hope for is to get it onto or near the runway, to minimize the impact forces, to give everyone aboard the best possible chance of survival. Haynes makes an announcement to the passengers, his voice calm and authoritative, explaining that they'll be making an emergency landing at Sioux City, that the flight attendants will instruct them in emergency procedures, that his signal to brace for impact will be the word brace, repeated 3 times. In the cabin, the flight attendants brief passengers on the brace position, head down, hands gripping ankles, feet flat on the floor, and begin preparing the cabin for crash landing. They collect sharp objects, secure loose items, review the locations of emergency exits, prepare themselves mentally for what's coming. The aircraft continues its approach, visible now from the airport. A silver DC-10 with its landing gear extended. Fitch had manually lowered the gear using the emergency extension system, hoping that trapped hydraulic fluid might provide some control authority, though it didn't. Descending toward runway 22 at speeds and rates that make a survivable landing seem impossible. Fire trucks race to reposition themselves along runway 22, clearing the runway, preparing for the worst. Spectators and airport workers watch, some of them recording the approach on video cameras, capturing what will become one of the most dramatic pieces of aviation footage ever recorded. At 4 p.m., 44 minutes after the engine failure, Flight 232 is on short final approach, perhaps 300 feet above the ground, perhaps a mile from the runway threshold. Fitch is working the throttles constantly, trying to control the descent, trying to keep the wings level. The aircraft is descending at 1,850 feet per minute, traveling at 220 knots, both numbers far outside the normal landing envelope. Then, in the final moments before touchdown, the situation deteriorates further. The aircraft begins rolling to the right, the roll accelerating despite Fitch's efforts to counter it. The right wing drops 10 degrees, 15 degrees, 20 degrees. On the cockpit voice recorder, the crew's voices become urgent. Left, left, left. Fitch is pushing both throttles full forward, trying desperately to generate enough thrust to stop the roll. But the engines can't spool up fast enough. The ground proximity warning system begins its insistent alarm. Whoop, whoop, pull up. Whoop, whoop, pull up. But they can't pull up. They have no elevator control. And even if they did, they're too low, too fast, too committed. The right wing strikes the ground first, hitting the runway at a point approximately 1,800 feet from the threshold, traveling at 220 knots. The impact is catastrophic. The wing shatters, fuel tanks rupture, and the fuel ignites instantly, creating a massive fireball. The force of the impact tears the right wing off completely, and the aircraft begins to cartwheel, though investigators will later determine this description isn't quite accurate. It's more that the aircraft breaks into large sections that tumble and slide across the runway. The tail section separates from the fuselage at the initial impact point. The rest of the aircraft bounces, sheds the landing gear and engine nacelles, breaks into multiple large pieces. The main section of fuselage rolls inverted and slides across the runway upside down, skidding off the runway into an adjacent cornfield, finally coming to rest about 4,200 feet from the initial impact point. The inverted fuselage has come to rest partially on the runway, partially in the cornfield, surrounded by fire and wreckage and strewn debris. Despite the violence of the impact, the crash is survivable for many aboard because several factors align in favor of survival. The aircraft, though traveling too fast, hit in a relatively nose-up attitude, which meant the main landing gear absorbed much of the initial impact. The breakup distributed impact forces throughout the airframe, rather than concentrating them. The fireball, though dramatic, was primarily external. The fuel that ignited was spilled fuel outside the fuselage, not fuel burning inside the cabin. Many seats remained attached to the floor. The tail section, which separated early, came to rest upright and relatively intact, and most of the passengers in that section survived. The emergency response was immediate and massive. Within seconds of impact, fire crews were spraying foam on the fires, creating paths for survivors to escape. National Guard personnel rushed to the scene, pulling survivors from the wreckage, performing triage, organizing evacuation. The first ambulances arrived within minutes, having been pre-positioned around the airport. The passengers and crew, those who were conscious and able to move, evacuated through breaks in the fuselage, through emergency exit doors, through holes torn in the aircraft's skin. Some jumped from the wreckage. Some were pulled out by rescuers. Some crawled through smoke and fire to reach safety. The scene was chaotic. Smoke everywhere, fire in multiple locations, debris scattered across hundreds of yards, people running or stumbling or being carried, emergency vehicles converging from all directions, the wail of sirens constant. But through the chaos, the emergency response worked exactly as it was supposed to work. Survivors were triaged into categories: critical, serious, minor injuries, uninjured. The most seriously injured were transported immediately to hospitals. Those with moderate injuries waited for the next wave of ambulances. Those who were uninjured or had only minor injuries were gathered in safe areas and later transported to local facilities for examination. The final count would show 112 fatalities and 184 survivors. Of the fatalities, most died from the violence of the initial impact, blunt force trauma, catastrophic injuries that no one could have survived. Some died from smoke inhalation. A few died later from their injuries despite medical care. But 184 people walked away or were carried away with survivable injuries. And this number, 184 survivors, from what should have been an unsurvivable crash, is what makes United Flight 232 remarkable. 13 passengers were completely uninjured, walking off the aircraft without a scratch. Many others had moderate injuries, broken bones, lacerations, burns, that would heal with time and treatment. Some had serious injuries that would affect them for life, but they were alive. In the cockpit, the 4 pilots were trapped for 35 minutes before rescuers could reach them. The inverted cockpit was buried partially in debris, and it took time to locate it and cut through to reach them. When rescuers finally reached the cockpit and pulled the crew out, they found all 4 pilots alive. Captain Haynes had relatively minor injuries. First Officer Records had minor injuries. Flight Engineer Dvorak was seriously injured but stable. Captain Fitch was the most seriously injured, with multiple fractures and internal injuries, barely clinging to life. All 4 would eventually recover, though Fitch's injuries would take years to heal, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. The investigation into United Flight 232 began immediately, as it always does. National Transportation Safety Board investigators arrived in Sioux City within hours, even as rescuers were still pulling survivors from the wreckage. The crash site was secured, photographed, documented. Every piece of the aircraft, every fragment of debris, was cataloged and analyzed. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were recovered quickly. Both had survived the impact and fire, protected by their reinforced casings, and were sent to the NTSB laboratory for download and analysis. The cockpit voice recorder's data was particularly valuable, preserving the crew's conversations, their attempts to control the aircraft, their coordination with air traffic control. Every sound and word from the initial bang of the engine failure through the final moments before impact. The flight data recorder provided the quantitative data: altitude, airspeed, heading, engine parameters, control inputs, that allowed investigators to reconstruct exactly what the aircraft did during those 44 minutes between engine failure and impact. Together, these recordings told a complete story of the crew's heroic efforts to save the aircraft. But the key to understanding why the accident happened lay not in the wreckage in Sioux City, but in a farm field near Alta, Iowa, 40 miles away. The main section of the failed fan disc, having separated from the engine at 37,000 feet, had fallen to earth and buried itself in the soil of a cornfield. Finding it became a priority for investigators because examining the disk would reveal why it failed. An extensive ground search was organized, covering miles of farmland, looking for fragments of titanium. In late August, more than a month after the crash, a farmer located the missing fan disk section in his field, partially buried, partially above ground. The disk was carefully excavated, transported to the NTSB Metallurgical Laboratory, and subjected to exhaustive analysis. What investigators discovered was both fascinating and troubling. The disk had failed due to a fatigue crack that originated from a hard alpha inclusion in the titanium alloy. The inclusion itself was caused by nitrogen contamination during the melting process used to create the titanium billet from which the disk was machined. The contamination created a region of brittle material that didn't have the same properties as the surrounding titanium. At some point during forging or machining, this brittle region cracked, creating a tiny defect. During the disk's 18 years of service, this crack grew slowly through metal fatigue, propagating a fraction of a millimeter with each thermal or load cycle, until it reached critical size and the disk failed catastrophically. The troubling part was that this defect should have been detected during manufacturing. Titanium components for jet engines undergo multiple inspections, including ultrasonic testing, specifically designed to find internal flaws. But this particular defect was either too small, too deep, or oriented in such a way that the inspection techniques used in 1971 didn't catch it. The disk was approved and installed, and the defect remained hidden for nearly 2 decades, growing slowly, waiting to fail. The investigation revealed that the titanium billet used to make this disk had initially been rejected by inspectors at the Titanium Metals Corporation facility where it was cast, flagged for having an unsatisfactory ultrasonic indication. But somehow this rejected billet ended up being used anyway, possibly due to paperwork errors, possibly because the rejection was overturned. The exact sequence never fully clarified. The NTSB's final determination of probable cause placed responsibility on inadequate human factors consideration in the inspection and quality control procedures at United's engine overhaul facility, which failed to detect the crack, and on the manufacturing defect in the disk itself. But the report also noted that the subsequent catastrophic disintegration of the disk resulted in debris distribution and energy levels that exceeded the protection provided by the DC-10's hydraulic system design. In simpler terms, the hydraulic systems were designed to be redundant and independent.
No one had anticipated a scenario where all 3 systems would be destroyed by a single event. The report made numerous recommendations, many of which were implemented quickly. Engine disk inspection procedures were enhanced, with new ultrasonic inspection techniques developed that could detect smaller defects. The titanium manufacturing process was improved, moving from double vacuum to triple vacuum melting to further reduce the likelihood of contamination. Manufacturers and airlines inspected fan disks already in service, finding several with similar defects that were removed from service before they could fail. Hydraulic system design philosophy was revised to ensure that no single event, no matter how improbable, could disable all hydraulic systems. The DC-10 fleet was modified to include hydraulic fuses in System 3, installed below the tail engine, to prevent complete fluid loss if lines were severed. The FAA mandated changes to maintenance procedures and inspection requirements. But perhaps the most significant legacy of United Flight 232 had nothing to do with engines or hydraulics. It had to do with people, with how flight crews work together, with what's now called Crew Resource Management, or CRM. The accident demonstrated, in the most dramatic way possible, the value of CRM. The concept that the captain should not be an authoritarian figure whose word is law, but rather a leader who encourages input from all crew members, who leverages everyone's knowledge and experience, who creates an environment where people feel empowered to speak up, to question, to contribute. United Airlines had been practicing CRM for a decade before Flight 232, and the crew's performance that day validated the concept completely. Captain Haynes, in particular, became a powerful advocate for CRM in the years after the accident. He recovered from his injuries, returned to flying, and retired from United in 1991 when he reached the mandatory retirement age. After retirement, he became a public speaker, giving talks about Flight 232, about CRM, about leadership and teamwork, and staying calm under pressure. His talks were often deeply moving, combining technical detail with human emotion, acknowledging the 112 people who died while celebrating the 184 who survived, always giving credit to everyone involved: the crew, the air traffic controllers, the emergency responders, the people of Sioux City. Haynes never took personal credit for saving the aircraft. He always said it was a team effort, that without records and Dvorak, and especially Fitch, without the flight attendants who evacuated passengers, without the controllers who guided them, without the first responders who pulled people from the wreckage, the outcome would have been far worse. The NTSB's conclusion, based on flight simulator testing, was striking and vindicated Haynes's efforts. The board concluded that successfully landing the damaged DC-10 on a runway after the complete loss of hydraulic flight controls was virtually impossible. Multiple test pilots attempted to reproduce the flight profile in simulators configured to match Flight 232's condition. None of them could land the simulated aircraft on a runway. Most couldn't even get close to an airport. Some crashed within minutes. The fact that the crew of Flight 232 not only flew the aircraft for 44 minutes, but actually got it to Sioux City and close enough to the runway that many survived, was deemed an extraordinary achievement that exceeded all reasonable expectations. Dennis Fitch, the training check pilot who had positioned himself between the pilots and controlled the throttles, suffered the most serious injuries of the 4 cockpit crew members. He underwent multiple surgeries, spent months recovering, endured years of physical therapy. He returned to flying eventually, but never fully recovered from his injuries. The experience affected him profoundly, not just physically, but emotionally. He carried guilt for decades about the 112 people who died, feeling somehow that if he'd been just a little more skilled with the throttles, if he'd made slightly different inputs, maybe more people would have survived. Friends and colleagues repeatedly told him he was a hero, that he'd saved 184 lives, that no one else could have done better. But Fitch, like many who've been through trauma, couldn't quite believe it. He became a speaker on aviation safety and CRM like Haynes, sharing his experiences, helping train other pilots. He passed away in 2012 from brain cancer, but his legacy endures. The people of Sioux City, too, became part of the story's legacy. In the days and weeks after the crash, the community rallied around survivors and victims' families with remarkable compassion. Hotels provided free rooms for families traveling to Iowa. Restaurants donated food. Ordinary citizens volunteered to help in any way they could. A memorial fund was established. Counseling services were provided. In the years since, Sioux City has maintained its connection to Flight 232, honoring the victims, commemorating the anniversary, preserving the memory of that day. A permanent memorial stands at the Mid-America Museum of Aviation and Transportation in Sioux City, with exhibits about the crash, artifacts from the wreckage, information about what happened and why, and what was learned. The DC-10 itself would fly for another 25 years after Flight 232, though its reputation never fully recovered from the accidents that plagued it. The last DC-10 passenger flight operated in 2014. The aircraft type is now retired from passenger service, though some still fly as freighters. The DC-10 was succeeded by the MD-11, an improved version with better aerodynamics and more modern systems. But the MD-11 never achieved the same commercial success. Today, the trijet configuration itself is virtually extinct in commercial aviation, replaced by more efficient twin-engine designs like the Boeing 777 and Airbus A330 and A350. But the lessons from Flight 232 endure, embedded in pilot training programs worldwide, in CRM courses that teach communication and teamwork and leadership, in maintenance procedures that emphasize rigorous inspection and quality control, in design philosophies that account for improbable failure modes, in the collective memory of an industry that learns from every accident and incident. Modern aircraft are safer partly because of what was learned from Flight 232, not just the technical lessons about titanium metallurgy and hydraulic system redundancy, but the human lessons about working together under pressure, about staying calm when panic would be understandable, about doing everything possible to save lives, even when the situation seems hopeless. Today, more than 35 years after the accident, the survivors of Flight 232 maintain connections with each other and with the first responders who saved their lives. Some have formed lasting friendships, bound together by shared trauma and shared survival. Many return to Sioux City for anniversaries, gathering at the memorial, sharing memories, honoring those who died, expressing gratitude for those who helped. Some have shared their stories publicly, speaking to schools and community groups, writing books, participating in documentaries. Others have chosen to remain private, processing their experience in their own ways. But all carry with them the memory of that July afternoon, of those 44 minutes in the air when everything changed, of the moment the aircraft hit the ground, of the chaos and terror and relief that followed. The 112 people who died on Flight 232 are remembered not just as statistics, but as individuals. Parents, children, spouses, friends, colleagues, each one a life cut short, each one mourned by those who knew them. Their names are preserved on memorial walls, in newspaper archives, in the memories of families and friends. Some of the stories are heartbreaking. A mother who died shielding her young child who survived. A man celebrating his anniversary with his wife, both killed. A young flight attendant on one of her first flights who died helping passengers evacuate. These stories remind us that behind every accident investigation, behind every technical analysis and safety recommendation, are human beings whose lives matter, whose losses are real. The story of United Airlines Flight 232 is ultimately a story about the limits of engineering and the potential of human skill and courage. It's a story that shows how even the most carefully designed systems can fail in unexpected ways, how assumptions about what's possible can be wrong, how probabilities of 1,000,000,000 to 1 can still come true. But it's also a story that shows what people can accomplish when they work together, when they refuse to give up, when they leverage every resource available, when they maintain composure and focus and determination in the face of the impossible. Captain Haynes, First Officer Records, Flight Engineer Dvorak, and Captain Fitch didn't save everyone. They couldn't. The aircraft was too damaged, the forces too great, the task too difficult. But they saved 184 people who, by all rights, should have died. And that achievement stands as a testament to skill and training and teamwork, and the indomitable human spirit. As you lie here tonight, drifting toward sleep, think about those 4 pilots in the cockpit of Flight 232, working together, each contributing what they could, staying calm, doing their best. Think about the flight attendants who evacuated passengers under the most chaotic conditions imaginable. Think about the first responders who rushed into fire and smoke to pull survivors from the wreckage. Think about the medical teams who worked through the night treating injuries. Think about the community of Sioux City that opened its heart to strangers in need. Think about the investigators who spent months analyzing every detail to understand what happened and how to prevent it from happening again. Think about the 184 survivors who were given second chances at life, who went home to families, who had children and grandchildren, who lived decades they might not have lived, but for the skill of their pilots and the grace of circumstance. The investigation is complete. The wreckage has long since been removed. The crash site is now farmland again, corn growing where once there was fire and wreckage. The lessons have been learned and implemented. The DC-10 has been retired. But the memory endures. The flight recorders have been silent for decades now, their data analyzed and understood and preserved. The crew has been honored and recognized. Captain Haynes lived to age 87, passing away in 2019, just days before what would have been his 88th birthday, 30 years after the accident that made him famous. Dennis Fitch is gone too, as are many of the survivors and first responders. But what they accomplished together on that July afternoon remains as inspiration and instruction. A reminder of what skilled professionals can achieve, of what teamwork and courage and determination can accomplish, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Good night, and may all your flights be safe ones. May your crews be as skilled and dedicated as those of Flight 232. May the lessons of the past protect the travelers of the future. And may we never forget that behind every accident, behind every statistic, behind every technical analysis, are human beings whose courage and skill and compassion make all the difference.